Well, Graham, I appreciate you doing this. It's incredibly. When I was told that you had consigned some of the art concerning the origins of Bane, not to mention from Vengeance of Bane, I thought, well, that's pretty dang cool. And you and I have exchanged a few emails, and certainly I know why you're doing it because it's time to share that art with other people who have come to love this character that you and Chuck Dixon have created.
Right.
So I wanted to talk to you about, the genesis of it and sort of what led to the creation of these pieces, because the genesis of Bane alone is a fascinating story. You and Chuck last year spent about 90 minutes on YouTube, in fact, talking about that. So recapping it here may not necessarily be the most exciting thing for folks, but it seems like in that conversation you and Chuck had, you learned a great deal about what led to the creation of Bane as well, about the conference over the creation of Nightfall, about Denny O'Neil's involvement, about sort of everybody getting involved and realizing there was the need to create this event for Batman, and that
Right.
Bane was a new character, needed to have it explained to folks, kind of that this was not just some schmuck that was going to wreak a little havoc and then go away, but this was in fact going to be a major addition to the Batman Rogues Gallery.
Hmm.
Is that, when you think about the evolution and what you've learned from your conversations with Chuck over the last, I don't know, few months, few years, few decades about the creation of Bane, what has surprised you most in terms of what you've learned about what led to the genesis of this character?
Well, I knew what led to it right from the beginning. I just wasn't in the initial story meetings. So I knew where we were going with it when they first contacted me about doing it. They had already lined up what the idea was going to be. It was they needed a villain that was going to take out Batman. And the impetus for that was because Denny was getting a lot of flack from fans about how the Punisher and Wolverine, killed their villains, and it was a much more violent time. And they said, we should have a more violent Batman. Batman needs to step up his game, so to speak. And Denny felt that was a really horrible idea. But why don't we try to give them what they ask for, but show them why they're wrong? And so that's where the idea that we were going to take him out and replace him with Azrael, who was a violent, psychotic Batman. And we needed a villain to do it because there was nobody in the Rogues Gallery that was either smart enough or strong enough. There's smart ones and there's strong ones, but there wasn't one that had the two together. And so the concept came from, well, at least it was presented to me, is that Bane is an evil Doc Savage.
Right.
So, when I was designing Bane, particularly without his mask, I went right to James Bama's Doc Savage paintings, and I looked at his features and stuff, and I even gave him the widow's peak and then shaved the back of his head for the ports, because I was a huge Doc Savage fan. So that was a lot of fun.
As a kid, I was a huge Ron Ely fan.
A huge what fan?
Ron Ely's version of Doc
Oh,
Savage.
Ron Ely. Oh, really? You're the one who liked that movie.
I have it on DVD. So don't judge.
Okay.
So when you, because I think his name, he obviously didn't have a name initially. It was what, Doc Venom. It was sort
Doc
of
Toxic.
Doc Toxic. That was it.
Yeah, that was his placeholder name.
So as you're creating him, and I know we have some images that are part of the auction of the concept art. So as you begin to create him and as you begin to write him and as you and Chuck begin to talk about and think about him, sort of walk me through a little bit about this, Venom was certainly already at that point part of the Batman storyline, correct?
Yeah, Denny had introduced that in a Legends of the Dark Knight story called Venom. The Batman needed an edge. He wanted an edge, so he was juicing, and it messed him up. And and then in our story, Venom, nobody could survive the Venom experiments except Bane, because all the other subjects were killed or died from it.
Right, because there was I think you and Chuck talked about the fact that Denny was sort of, it was sort of a reference to Denny's own addiction problems, is something that Chuck had talked about. It was fascinating because I think this, to me, what made this so interesting is that it really did sort of bring some real world issues in a very thoughtful and provocative way to Batman and to this villain.
Yeah, Denny, had some addiction issues that he had beaten by then, but he was fully aware of them. And that was an aspect of Bane that, Bane was an addict, basically up until Vengeance of Bane 2 when he got locked up in jail and had to get off the juice.
Right.
But when I was designing the character, I knew about steroids and stuff. I'd been a weightlifter and athlete in my youth, and I followed a lot of those magazines and stories, and I knew what some of the side effects of steroids were. So, like when I designed the look of Bane for his face, I gave him this very unique jawline where his this mandible part comes out, and there was a bodybuilder by the name of Tom Platt who had that. That's why you always see that highlight by his jawline, because it sticks out further. And hair, body hair, and pimples. You can see the pimples all over him there too.
Right. The acne all over body as a result of the steroid use is a fascinating little note there that I noticed the very first time I looked at this.
Yeah, and you never see anybody else draw that on him either.
Right.
A lot of guys don't even put the shoulder and back hair on, but nobody else puts the pimples, the acne.
So as he began to take shape in your mind, walk me through a little bit about that, because as you began to put pencil to paper and begin to shape him, were there things that you thought, well, this is too much, this is too little, this is not indicative of the kind of guy that I'd like to create? Because at some point you know that this is going to be the guy who breaks the Batman. That is the whole point of, after all, the Nightfall series. Vengeance of Bane is meant to introduce the readers to Bane to make sure they understand the significance of his role in the Batman universe. So walk me through a little bit in terms of how you began to shape him, and how Chuck and what his involvement was. I mean, when you would bring these sketches to him, what was his reaction to them?
Well, I had notes from Chuck from the meetings, like who Bane was. He was going to be raised in this prison, in this either Central or South American prison, sort of oblique where it is, but it's somewhere down there. That he's Hispanic, and he grew up in this prison. So when we needed a costume for him, I tended to lean towards the Mexican luchador look, because I figured if he was going to be inspired by something, that would be the costume that he'd be inspired by. So I went, full on Mexican luchador with the face mask. And as you can see in the original sketch, his nose, mouth, and eyes are open.
Right, which I found very fascinating, because it completely sort of changes my perception of Bane when I see that, in fact, his mouth was not covered initially.
Well, we all know what it's like to wear masks nowadays, and it's a pain in the butt, and you can't breathe. And there's a reason the wrestlers wear them with the open stuff, so they can breathe. It's hotter than hell. So I was going for the realism, and B, the functionality, and C, the ability artistically to have the character emote. I thought he was kind of scary looking with the nose and mouth peering out, and I could have him gritting his teeth or showing shock or something like that. DC Editorial made the decision to close up the mask and make him a mystery man. So that left me with, if I had to have him emote in some type of way, whether it be anger or surprise or something, I have to do the Steve Ditko Spider-Man mask thing, where you have the eyes expand, or one part of the mask go up, if he's quizzical, that kind of stuff. It's basically artistic license versus a realistic.
But does that change when they say, all right, we're going to cover his nose, we're going to cover his mouth, and you decide that, all right, I'm going to have to go that Ditko route and sort of use the mask to give him the expressions. At the same time, does that change how you think about how he sounds, how he talks, what he is, what he does? Because when you cover him up and when he becomes a significantly bigger mystery man in that regard, I sort of wonder, what that does to your perception of the character that you have in fact created.
It really had no effect on it. I knew in my mind who this character was, his voice, his body language, all that stuff I already had down. Covering up the face didn't do anything other than allow me some graphic tricks that I could use the same way you do with Batman. You know, you could have him in shadow and have the whites of his eyes showing, even though his eyes don't glow. Um, you know, so there's some kind of interesting graphics you can use with that mask, which I couldn't have used with the open mask.
What was your reaction the first time you saw Chuck's story? I mean, because I think, if I'm not mistaken, the two of you worked on it together. I mean, it wasn't like here's the story, now go fill in the blanks.
No, no, that's not true. Chuck's script was fully formed when I
Yeah.
got it. And I remember reading it. I called him immediately. I said, "Oh, this is a masterpiece. This is really, really great." Um, and the funny thing is, when I look back at Vengeance of Bane #1, you know, I look back on any of my work and I usually tear it up. I'm like, you know, I should have done this. I could have done that.
Sure.
Um, but when I look back on Vengeance of Bane, I'm amazed at how well it came out. I don't criticize it. I think the storytelling is great. The graphics are great. The script is great. You know, all of that. It's one of those books that's right at the top of my list. You know, there's like 3 or 4 of them that I'm like, yeah, hit that on all cylinders. You know.
And at my comic shop, it remains easily and readily available. It gets reprinted all the time. It's certainly a book that, though it has been collected repeatedly in different Nightfall volumes and variations, Vengeance of Bane is a book that people still to this day can go into their comic shop and buy singularly.
Well, they just released it this past month,
Yeah.
the facsimile edition of it. So they've reprinted it exactly like it was with the ads and everything. And it looks amazing, you know. But you know, the other interesting historical aspect about Vengeance of Bane is that it's the first introduction to a villain in his own book.
I did not know that was the. It doesn't surprise me, and it makes
Yeah.
complete sense when you say it.
Now the
But
Joker had his own book, but Joker appeared in Batman #1.
right,
This is the first time where a villain, other than maybe if you said Fu Manchu, you know, which they released back in the 1950s or something,
right.
I think. You know, this is a brand new character. Fu Manchu had already been around for many, many years from Sax Rohmer's books. But this is the first time a brand new villain has been introduced in his own comic book.
So when you found out that was going to be the case, and let's talk about that because it is fascinating. In as much as that, when I think about, you know, you have a villain who gets an origin story in which Batman is a very minor character. He doesn't appear until the last few pages.
Yeah.
And he's sort of threatened, but he doesn't really have much involvement in it. He's a background figure, you know, despite his presence on the cover of the book.
Mm-hmm.
I sort of wonder, is that when you guys were working on it, when you're talking about it, when Chuck gives you that script, are you surprised by how little Batman factors into it, or are you sort of amazed by the fact that this character that you're creating is in fact that first villain to get his own book before he becomes the centerpiece of what is going to be a significant storyline for DC's flagship character?
Well, it made sense not to have Batman in it that much because we were setting him up for the Nightfall thing, and that's where, you know, all the heavy lifting was going to get done.
Right.
But the job we had was to make this character interesting and make the readers like him enough so that when we do launch him in Batman and Detective into the Nightfall storyline, that they accept him and are willing to buy into the narrative that we're about to tell.
Right.
Yeah, that's the first time they actually meet each other and exchange conversation.
When you look at these pages now, given the, you know, the decades since you've drawn them, it is remarkable to me how amazingly fresh they remain, how amazingly brand new they look to me, as someone who's read these for, you know, decades. I will say that Vengeance of Bane, strangely enough, remains my favorite story in the entire Nightfall series.
Cool.
In a weird way. I mean, the breaking of the bat and the whole Azrael storyline, while fascinating and while compelling, there is something about understanding the motivations of and having some sense of compassion for someone who becomes basically the most violent of the most successfully violent villains in Batman's career.
Yeah, I think what separates Bane from other villains and lesser villains, and the thing that interests me him the most in him the most, is that if you think about it, Bane is an innocent. He didn't do anything wrong. He was just a kid that was born in this society where he had to serve the prison sentence of his father, who was a jerk, who did do bad things, and this poor kid now becomes this monster because of his environment. And so when Bane goes out into the world and he does these bad things, he doesn't think of himself as a villain. He thinks of himself as a victim. When he does bad things, Bane thinks that the world owes him.
Right.
And I find that fascinating that he goes through life thinking the world owes him something, which is kind of a messed up psyche. And there's a lot of people who go through the world today that think that that didn't get raised in a prison. They think the world owes them something. Well, Bane thinks that way too. And so when he does these bad things, he's justifying it in his own mind.
Right. But again, it goes back to this idea that you see, because you've seen him as a child, when you grow up, when you as a reader watch a character grow up through the abuse, through the violence, through all the other issues that he faces as a child, it does really give you a different sense. And I sort of wondered, I remember reading this when it came out, and I remember thinking, is this going to be a template for sort of how we think of and treat and approach villains of the future? Because certainly, the anti-hero becomes a significant character in television and in film, certainly over the last 20 years, whether it's Tony Soprano, whether it's Breaking Bad, and so forth. You understand their motivations. You spend enough time with these characters early on to where you know who they are and more importantly, why they are. And for Bane, that is, I think, really a fascinating entry into the character. And I've always sort of wondered if it's why he is so impactful throughout popular culture, not to mention certainly the Batman series alone over the next 30 years. Bane being a character who I probably took on a life that I don't imagine you or Chuck ever could have imagined.
Well, when we first created him, we assumed that he was going to be popular within the storyline that we were setting him out for. And then shortly thereafter, he appeared in the animated series. And that was his first foray into another aspect of pop culture.
Right.
And I was like, oh, wow, this is really cool. He's in the animated series, and I love that version, by the way. Henry Silva doing the voice of Bane with a Hispanic accent was just dead on. And they used my original mask. They had the nose and the mouth out. They had the eyes. I think the eyes were the red, but the nose and the mouth were open. And I thought, oh yeah, that's really cool. But after that, there was a lull. Then he appears in Batman and Robin. Sort of. But it's still, they call him Bane. But then there was a real lull. There was very little talk of him. They didn't use him in anything. But then in the 2000s, I think it was Gotham. It was a video game, Gotham, Arkham Asylum,
right,
came out, and Bane was like the major baddie in that, and that's when, in my eyes, he really took off because he now was introduced to an entirely new generation, in the platform that they like to see. It wasn't a comic generation; it was gamers who may like comics as well. But that's when he started to step off into other popular culture things, and really begin to take off. And then I think that was the light bulb that went on that said, "Hey, you know what? This guy's here to stay now."
Well, I mean, it's funny. People talk about it certainly in the Christopher Nolan film, but it's interesting. I think his life, in a lot of ways, is in the Harley Quinn animated series for HBO. And, the Tom King variation of it. I mean, he is a character that you just find is so malleable to so many different creators who choose to use him in so many different ways.
Hmm.
And I sort of wonder if that surprises you. I mean, it's one thing to see him as the bad guy in the final Batman movie, but it's another thing to see him in comic relief, and again as a character that sort of you have compassion for, or you find to be amusing. He's delightful in the Harley Quinn series, and Tom King then chooses to use him in the way that he does. And do you does it change your relationship with him as you see these different iterations of him?
Not at all. I'm of the mind if Chuck doesn't write it and I don't draw it, it's not Bane. It's as simple as that. It's maybe some iteration. There's not a lot of writers that understand the nuances of the character and the artists as well. There hasn't been a lot of versions that I've liked. When Chuck and I a couple of years ago, we got to do a 12-issue series called Bane Conquest,
Right.
and that's when we brought Bane back to his roots as a brilliant tactician and as a thinker. And so many times they write him as just a musclehead, and then they got to throw the obligatory backbreaking scene in, and it's like, well, dudes, that's been done. There's much more to his character than that. And those are the things we were exploring in Bane Conquest, and we left a lot of Easter eggs in that about where we wanted to go with Bane. We were setting Bane up as the Doctor Doom of the DC universe. He was importing tech from Apocalypse and stuff like that, and DC decided they didn't want to do any more of that, so their loss.
I mean, I assume that you think of revisiting him or hope to revisit him often, right?
The comic book business is not what it used to be. So,
That is correct.
I've played in that sandbox for almost 40 years. Played with those characters when I recognized them. I don't really recognize them now. Now I do my own things. I publish my own books, write my own books, and I'm infinitely happier doing it that way in today's market.
Do you, as you were picking the pieces to send here, I'll end it here because I am sort of fascinated, and we've talked again about the fact that it is time for you to share these with the people who have adored this character, who have
Mm-hmm.
created their own relationship with, and can't wait to own this sort of the original piece from the origin story.
Mm-hmm.
When you went and held them, and I don't know how often you go back and look at them or how often you held them in recent years, but when you go back and look at them, it certainly takes you back, I assume, to those moments with Chuck, to getting the script, to reading the book, to drawing him, to creating him, to those conceptual renderings of not just him, but certainly his henchmen as well. I mean, it is, that there is that hand, one thing I love about original art is that it doesn't get any closer to the source than this.
Yeah.
And then when you recall the impact that Vengeance of Bane had on readers like myself, who just
Mm-hmm.
were enamored of this book and who really took to this character and the story behind him, I sort of wonder what it was like for you to go back and pull these pieces and to put them in an envelope and to say farewell to this
Mm-hmm.
to this particular moment.
Well, Bane has been very good to me. He's been like this little brother of mine that has been on my shoulder now for 30 years. And I have a flat folder file. You said you couldn't believe how good a shape that the pages were in. Well, I've got a flat folder file back there where they've been sitting, out of the sunlight, out of anything. One of the pages, the first appearance of Bane in full costume with his minions in full costume, that semi-splash, that hung right back here on my wall for almost 30 years. I had to take it out of the frame to send it to you guys. But yeah, I stopped selling my artwork over 20 years ago, probably 25 years ago. And so there's not a lot that's on the market that has come from me. Inkers have maybe sold stuff, but it hasn't come from me. And I kept a bunch of key pages that one being one of them, and all the ones that you guys now have in your possession. But I just felt like, it was time. I've seen them, I've held them, I've experienced them, and I know what it's like to find some Grail thing, that you've loved as a kid, whether it be a comic book or original art. You're like, oh wow, so I know what that feeling's like, and I know whoever ends up with these pages is going to feel the same way. They're going to hold that, and they're going to see, this is what I remember reading in the comic book as a kid, and here's the original hand-drawn art inked by the wonderful Eduardo Barreto. God bless his soul. I'm sorry he's not here anymore to have experienced what it was like for the character. He had passed before there was a real explosion of the character. So he was certainly an integral part of our team, and a beloved friend and an incredible artist.
Well, Graham, I appreciate you doing this. Again, it's I've had this for a year because I've loaned out my copy of Vengeance of Bane to several people. But when I went to my comic shop the other day and saw a fresh stack of the facsimile copy, I picked up one of those too and thought,
oh,
well,
nice.
It's about time I had one of those yet again. So
to get the foil one?
Yes.
That's really cool looking. I like that.
I may have to send it to you. I'll have you. I will say this. Everybody, I assume, in the comics world hopes to have that one character, that one creation, that one moment that lives on, well, beyond whatever it is they end up doing later. Bane is certainly a fascinating character, not simply for what he does, but for who he is. And
yeah.
That is a credit to you and the show.
Thank you. One other thing I just want to mention about that design, that piece that was just popped up there, is that the amazing thing is 98% there. Only the mask is different. In my first sketch, like pencil sketch drawing, the only other difference was I had more wires going into his head. But other than that, it's exactly like the first sketch drawing.
That is an extraordinary thing.
To hit it right from the get-go is like, wow. Because normally, let's change this, let's do that, but editorial said, yeah, nailed it.
You don't often get to be the baseball player who hits the home run at the first at bat.
Yes, exactly right.
Well, man, I appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Robert. It was nice talking with you.
Likewise.